I've always been skeptical about urban legends. Growing up, my friends would whisper about them during sleepovers, the kind of stories meant to give you chills before bedtime. But there was one tale that always stood out, one that felt too vivid to dismiss. The story of Kuchisake-onna, the Slit-Mouthed Woman. They said she would wander the streets at night, her face hidden by a surgical mask, a question ready on her lips. If you answered wrong, or sometimes even if you answered right, she would reveal her twisted grin and make you pay for it. It sounded absurd back then, like something plucked straight out of a horror movie. But now, I'm not so sure. I live in a small town where stories like this cling to the air like fog, passed down from one generation to the next. Recently, the whispers have returned, and with them, a peculiar unease. People claim to have seen her again. A co-worker mentioned his cousin's friend who was walking home late and heard soft footsteps behind him. When he turned, there she was, standing under a flickering street lamp. He ran before she could say anything. I dismissed it, of course. People love to scare themselves with stories like that. But as I walked home late one night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was a quiet evening, the kind where every sound feels amplified. My footsteps echoed in the empty streets, the faint glow of streetlights casting long shadows. The cold air bit at my skin, and I pulled my coat tighter around me. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, its voice breaking the stillness. That's when I noticed it, the strange sensation of being watched. I paused and glanced over my shoulder. Nothing, just the same empty street stretching behind me. I told myself it was my imagination, but as I walked, the feeling grew stronger, like a presence hovering just out of sight. My mind wandered back to those childhood stories, and for the first time, they didn't seem so far-fetched. It was then I saw her. The first thing I noticed was her silhouette, a figure standing beneath a streetlight at the far end of the road. She wasn't moving, just standing there, the glow from the lamp casting long, distorted shadows around her. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to process what I was seeing. She was dressed in a beige trench coat, her head slightly tilted down as if she were staring at the ground. A surgical mask covered the lower half of her face, and her hair fell in long, dark strands over her shoulders. At first, I thought it might just be someone out for a late walk, but something about her posture, rigid, unnatural, made me hesitate. My pulse quickened. "Keep walking," I told myself. "It's just a person." I averted my gaze and started moving again, my footsteps suddenly sounding too loud in the silence. But I couldn't shake the feeling of her eyes on me. Against my better judgment, I glanced back. She had moved closer. I hadn't heard her footsteps, but she was now halfway down the block, standing completely still. The air felt colder, heavier. A knot of dread formed in my stomach, and every instinct screamed at me to keep going. But then she spoke. "Do you think I'm beautiful?" Her voice was soft, almost melodic, yet it carried an edge that sent chills racing down my spine. I stopped dead in my tracks, my mind racing. The question was familiar, too familiar. It was the same one I'd heard in every retelling of the legend. My heart pounded as I turned slowly to face her. She had moved closer still, standing just a few feet away now. Her eyes, dark and unblinking, locked onto mine. "I said," she repeated, her tone eerily calm. "Do you think I'm beautiful?" Panic coursed through me, but I managed to force out a shaky yes. For a moment there was silence. Her head tilted slightly to the side, as if she were considering my answer. Then, with a deliberate motion, she reached up and pulled down her mask. The sight was worse than I could have imagined. Her mouth stretched unnaturally wide, slashed from ear to ear in a grotesque, jagged grin. The flesh around the wounds was raw and red, the scars glistening under the pale streetlight. "Even now?" she asked, her smile widening as she took a step closer. For a moment, I was paralyzed by the sight of her mutilated face. My legs felt like lead, My thoughts scrambled in a cacophony of panic and disbelief. Then, without thinking, I turned and ran. The night swallowed me whole as I sprinted down the street, my breathing ragged, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear the soft, almost deliberate sound of her footsteps behind me, light, measured, as if she were toying with me. I pushed myself harder, my sneakers pounding against the pavement, desperate to put as much distance between us as possible. The houses around me blurred into streaks of dark shapes, but all I could focus on was finding somewhere, anywhere, to hide. I turned down an alley, the walls narrowing around me. My lungs burned, and my legs ached, but I couldn't stop. I spotted a dumpster and dove behind it, crouching low and pressing my back against the cold, metal surface. The alley was silent except for the distant hum of a streetlight. I held my breath, straining to hear any sound of pursuit. Seconds passed, then minutes, and still nothing. Maybe I'd lost her. I allowed myself a moment to catch my breath, wiping sweat from my forehead with a trembling hand. But just as I began to feel a sliver of relief, a shadow fell over me. I looked up, and there she was. She stood at the entrance of the alley, her head tilted at that unsettling angle, her dark eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. Her scissors gleamed in the faint light, their edges impossibly sharp. "Do you think you can escape me?" she asked, her voice carrying a mocking lilt. Adrenaline surged through me, overriding the paralyzing fear. Without hesitation, I grabbed a loose brick from the ground and hurled it in her direction. It struck the wall near her head, shattering into pieces, but she didn't even flinch. I took off again, this time aiming for the far end of the alley. My mind was a blur of desperation and instinct, every fiber of my being focused on survival. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to keep moving. The sound of her laughter echoed behind me, chilling and haunting. "You can't run forever," she called out, her voice fading as I turned another corner. I found myself on an unfamiliar street, the buildings looming over me like silent sentinels. I ducked into the doorway of an abandoned storefront, my chest heaving as I tried to think of my next move. But as I stood there, hidden in the shadows, a horrifying thought gripped me. What if she wasn't just a legend? What if she was something worse, something unstoppable? I stayed in the shadows of the abandoned storefront, my body trembling as I strained to hear any sign of her. My mind raced through the stories I'd heard as a child, the warnings whispered by elders about the Kuchisake-onna. They were meant to be cautionary tales, right? Fables to keep children from wandering the streets alone. But now, faced with the reality of her, I realized those stories weren't just myths. They were warnings. I couldn't stay hidden forever. My instinct screamed at me to run, to find safety, but something in me resisted. Maybe it was desperation or a fool's courage, but I decided I needed to face her. I didn't know if I could fight her, but I couldn't keep running blindly into the night. Cautiously, I stepped out of the doorway and into the dimly lit street. The air was heavy, and the oppressive silence seemed to thicken around me. Each step echoed unnaturally, as though the street itself were amplifying my presence. Then I saw her. She stood at the far end of the street, her figure silhouetted against the glow of a flickering streetlight. Her long, dark hair hung like a curtain over her face, and her scissors gleamed ominously in her hand. For a moment, we just stood there, staring at each other. I swallowed hard and forced my voice to work. "Why are you doing this?" Her head tilted slightly, and she took a step forward. "Do you think I chose this?" she asked, her voice low and venomous. I stepped back instinctively, but I held my ground. "What do you want from me?" She laughed softly, the sound cold and devoid of humor. "You people always ask the same questions. You never understand." Her hand moved to the mask covering her face. Slowly, deliberately, she pulled it down, revealing her grotesquely mutilated mouth. The sight made my stomach churn, but I forced myself to look. "Do you think I'm beautiful?" she asked, her voice now dripping with malice. I froze, the weight of the question pressing down on me. I knew the stories. How you answered would determine your fate. But now, standing before her, I realized there was no right answer. Her dark eyes bore into mine, and I could feel the raw anger and pain behind them. This wasn't just a creature. This was someone who had suffered deeply, who had become a monster because of the cruelty of others. I mustered the courage to speak. I think no one deserves what happened to you." For a moment, her expression faltered. The cold malice in her eyes softened, replaced by something almost human, almost vulnerable. But it was fleeting. Her lips curled into a wicked smile, and she raised the scissors. "Kind words won't save you," she said, her voice now a deadly whisper. Panic surged through me as she lunged. I ducked and ran, my legs moving faster than they ever had before. I could hear her behind me, her footsteps impossibly close, the sound of her scissors snapping open and shut echoing in the night. I turned corner after corner, the streets blurring together in a disorienting maze. My lungs burned, my heart pounded, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't let her catch me. Finally, I saw a glimmer of hope, the faint glow of an open convenience store in the distance. Summoning every ounce of strength I had left, I sprinted toward it, praying that I could make it in time. Would the light be enough to keep her away? Or was I only delaying the inevitable? I burst into the convenience store, the bell above the door jingling as I stumbled inside. The bright fluorescent lights stung my eyes after the darkness of the streets, but the sudden illumination brought a fleeting sense of safety. The store was empty, save for a bored-looking clerk behind the counter. He glanced up from his phone, barely registering my disheveled appearance. I leaned against the counter, struggling to catch my breath, my heart pounding like a war drum in my chest. "Are you okay?" he asked, his tone indifferent. "She's out there," I gasped, turning to point at the door. "You need to lock it. Now." The clerk frowned, clearly confused. "What are you talking about? Who's out there?" Before I could answer, the bell above the door chimed again. I froze, my blood turning to ice. She was standing in the doorway, her silhouette framed against the dim streetlights outside. The clerk finally noticed her, his expression shifting from confusion to unease. "Miss, can I help you?" he asked, his voice uncertain. She stepped inside, her scissors glinting in the fluorescent light. Slowly, she turned her head toward me, her dark eyes locking onto mine. I backed away, my legs trembling. "Stay away," I shouted, my voice cracking. The clerk looked between us, clearly unsure of what was happening. "Hey, you can't bring weapons in here," he said, trying to sound authoritative but failing miserably. She ignored him, her focus entirely on me. Her hand moved to her mask, and once again, she revealed her mutilated face. "Do you think I'm beautiful?" she asked, her voice eerily calm. The clerk gasped audibly, stumbling back toward the counter. I could see the fear in his eyes now. He understood the danger. "Answer me," she demanded, taking a step closer. I shook my head, my back pressed against the cold shelves behind me. "Please, just leave me alone." Her smile widened, and she raised her scissors. "Wrong answer." Just as she lunged, the clerk screamed, grabbing a fire extinguisher from behind the counter and spraying it directly at her. The cloud of white foam engulfed her, causing her to shriek in anger and recoil. "Run!" the clerk shouted at me, his voice cutting through the chaos. I didn't need to be told twice. I darted toward the back of the store, my adrenaline surging as I pushed open the emergency exit and stumbled into the alley beyond. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop. I ran blindly through the maze of alleys, the sound of her screams fading behind me. My mind was a whirlwind of terror and disbelief. Finally, I emerged onto a busy street. The bright lights of the city and the chatter of pedestrians felt surreal after the nightmare I had just escaped. I collapsed onto a bench, my body shaking uncontrollably. Was it over? Had I really escaped her? As I sat there, trying to piece together what had just happened, a single thought echoed in my mind. The stories were real. She was real. And I had come terrifyingly close to becoming just another tale of the Kuchisake-onna.